Hello, fellow foodies, and welcome back to Foodie from Ecology, the science podcast for the food curious. Today, in celebration of International Women's Day, I'm so excited to speak with one of my role models in the field of ethnobotany. Dr. Nancy Turner is an ethnobotanist, a distinguished professor emerita, a fellow of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, and former Hakai professor in ethnoecology with the School of Environmental Studies at the University of Victoria, British Columbia, in Canada. Nancy has worked with First Nations elders and cultural specialists in Northwestern North America for more than 50 years, helping to document, retain, and promote their traditional knowledge of plants and environments, including Indigenous foods, materials, and traditional medicines. Her two-volume book, Ancient Pathways, Ancestral Knowledge, Ethnobotany and Ecological Wisdom of Indigenous Peoples of Northwestern North America, represents an integration of her long-term research. Her most recent edited volume is Plants, People, and Places, The Roles of Ethnobotany and Ethnoecology in Indigenous Peoples Land Rights in Canada and Beyond. Nancy has received a number of awards for her work, including membership in the Order of British Columbia and the Order of Canada, the Society for Economic Botany's Distinguished Economic Botanist Award, the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences Canada Prize in the Social Sciences for Ancient Pathways, and the Society of Ethnobiology's Distinguished Ethnobiologist Award. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Nancy. It's great to see you.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here with you.
Well, I thought we could just start with a bit of background and what brought you to the field of ethnobotany.
Oh gosh, I've loved plants since I was just a little kid toddling around. I spent my very early years in the hills above Missoula, Montana. And that was a wonderful place to fall in love with plants. And I was always interested, not just in the plants themselves, but how we humans have used them, and was always experimenting as a kid with, eating dandelions and making dye out of this or that plant. So by the time I got to high school, I heard about this field called ethnobotany. And I actually, by the time I was in grade 12, I had a copy of Erna Gunther's Ethnobotany of Western Washington. And I realized then that there was a field that of study that people could actually go into. And that's what I set my sights on by the time I was in university as an undergraduate. I did my honors thesis on ethnobotany of the Coast Salish peoples of Vancouver Island here. Did my term papers on ethnobotany, and I just got hooked from that point on.
It's great. It's great. And I think it's also notable that you really got into ethnobotany when there weren't that many women ethnobotanists. Now, of course, there are, but when you were coming up to your training, there weren't so many professors, female professors at that time.
No, actually, when I started, hardly anybody even knew what the word was. And what? What do you want to? What are you studying? It was really fun. I had to always explain. Ethnobotany is the study of the relationship between people and plants, and yeah, it wasn't a household word. It has been, I think, thanks to Richard Schultes and Wade Davis and others who have brought it up to that kind of household knowledge level. But back in those days, I was continuously explaining what I was interested in to everyone.
And so how would you describe ethnobotany and its importance? You defined it as the relationship between people and plants. And why is that important for us to understand humanity's relationship with nature?
Well, I think it's really important for all of us to recognize just how we humans are dependent on the plant world, and everywhere around the world, we humans have these relationships with plants as well as with animals and with ecosystems in general. But plants are essentially the original solar panels of the world. They're what provide all of us with the energy that we need to survive, us animals, and so they have a very special place as as the fundamental subsistence for us in terms of food, but also all the other ways that we depend on plants for our materials, for fuel, for um, clothing and wood and fiber and uh, medicine. And it's no wonder that everywhere in the world, people have developed these strong bonds with the plants that we rely on. And it's just so important to recognize. Sometimes it gets forgotten, especially if you're living in the city and there aren't very many plants around. That link has been kind of severed, but I think it's really important to reconnect it everywhere.
That's great. Well, one of the things I really admire about your work is your longstanding commitment to the true spirit of collaboration with elders and with communities that you've worked with over the span of your career. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about that, of what it's been like to
Ah.
have these longstanding collaborations.
You know, it almost brings tears to my eyes when I think about the people that I've worked with, the elders and the knowledgeable people, so wise, so kind, and I felt like it's the ultimate privilege to have been able to work with these people and to study and learn from them and have them share knowledge and share a mutual love of plants with me. And there's so many. I started to write down the names, and I could talk for hours on each and every one of them. Maybe I'll just start by talking about Christopher Paul, who was my very first teacher, and he lived out at Tsartlip in one of the Saanich communities out on the peninsula, and it was his son Philip was the chief of their community at the time and came and spoke in our anthropology class. So when I knew I wanted to do my honors work, got up my courage and I phoned him, and I asked if there might be someone in his community who might work with me and teach me about plants. And he said, I can still hear him. Oh, you want to learn all our secrets, do you? And I said, oh, no, no, not secrets, just anything you're willing to share. He laughed. He was teasing me, which I found was really a way that a lot of people have to just let you know that you're accepted. To be teased is a good thing.
Yeah.
And then he said his dad worked with some language students and he might be willing to teach me. So I phoned up his dad, Christopher, and every Tuesday afternoon I would go out to see him with an armload of plants. And we'd sit and he would tell me about them, their Saanich names, Sanchathan names, and talk about the chemists and some of the medicines. And we walked around his place. We saw he was still growing camas in his garden there, and we hiked up Llawelnoch, Mount Newton, and talked about the stories. And he was just a wonderful, kind man who I just loved. And he came to our wedding in
Uh,
1969. I still have the gift that he gave us, and his son Philip and his grandsons, his daughter, are all dear friends, and yeah, so just that was a wonderful beginning. I worked with other wonderful elders at that time as well, and then worked. often together with linguists, um,
Mhm.
because it made a nice three-way kind of support system. The elders were interested in having their knowledge recorded and the names of the plants recorded so that the younger people, the younger generations would have access to it. Um, and so they were willing and very happy to work with us and to record the names of the plants and then have them properly transcribed and have them properly botanically identified scientifically. So it was kind of a three-way partnership, um, and some of my publications reflect that linguist, knowledge, indigenous knowledge holder, and myself as ethnobotanist co-authorship. Um,
Great. And
yeah.
so your work is not just about the scientific study of these relationships, but also um, there's a lot of effort into conservation of knowledge and return of that knowledge to the communities.
Many, a number of the elders have told me when I was working with them, they were worried that what they had had the chance to learn as young people wasn't being passed on at that time when I was starting, especially. And this was very commonly thought, that people would say to me, "Oh, you're recording this knowledge. You better get it all recorded because it'll be gone in 10 years."
Wow.
Well, that was in the 1960s and 70s, and here it is, 2021, and that knowledge is still there. I still know so many people who have kept it. But at the same time, during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, um, there was a time when that knowledge it wasn't being passed to the younger generations, and younger people were just reeling from the impacts of residential schools and all of the other injustices. And so it was a time of turmoil, and the elders were really worried that what they knew and what they'd been able to learn as children and their experiences wouldn't be, they weren't able to teach their younger people. Um, but that is, as I said, that's changed. And I feel, in a sense, privileged to have served maybe as a bit of a bridge over that really crucial time to bring that knowledge forward. And now there are whole generations of younger Indigenous people who are just taking over and bringing that knowledge forward in a wonderful way. It's really exciting to see that.
Great. And so would you say, Nancy, that language and the knowing of language is also closely tied to this traditional knowledge of plants and their uses?
Absolutely, it is. Language is so important, and I'm not a fluent speaker of any language, but I know a lot of plant names in many languages. And I think that the botanical vocabulary is a specialized part of the languages. And so I've kind of focused on making sure that those names are kept and maintained and passed on because they really are specialized knowledge. It's important to have conversations day to day, but there's also the stories and the names for plants and animals and places and techniques and all of that specialized knowledge that also is needed for language revitalization and to continue that.
It's great. Well, a lot of the listeners to this podcast are really interested in food and how food impacts our health, how it impacts our culture. And I'm just wondering if you could give us some examples of perhaps indigenous foods and how they're tied to those landscapes.
Hmm. Well, okay, I'll start with another quick story, and that is about my dear friend, the late Dr. Mary Thomas from the Secwepemc Nation. I met her in the early 1990s, and she became a dear, dear friend. And I worked with her a lot, and although she'd gone to residential school, she had the opportunity to learn from her own mother and her grandmothers as a young woman. And so she knew so much and was so interested in plants. People called her Mother Nature because she was just like that. She was such a great teacher. Anyway, she talked about all of the berries, the huckleberries and the saskatoons, what you call sarvis berries in the States, and all of those with wonderful, we tried a lot of that food, but she talked about this one plant that her grandmothers used to harvest down in the river estuary in the Salmon River at Salmon Arm. And she said it was like round, like a marble. And she said her grandmothers used to dig it and throw it up on the bank. And the kids would gather it up, she and her brother and sister, and put it in a basket. They'd take it up and cook it. And she said it was called hkolkoloots, which means jaundiced yellow eyeball.
Okay.
Not a very inviting name, but I couldn't think about it, what it was. And then one of my students who was also working with Mary, Dawn Lowen, she was working on Chwee, yellow glacier lily with Mary. And she said, that sounds like Wapato, Sagittaria, Sagittaria latifolia. And so sure enough, um, that's what it turned out to be. And Mary described how it used to be so common down there, and they really enjoyed it. But lately, it wasn't there at all. They changed the topography by putting in a railway and the highway and cattle grazing down there, and there was no Wapato left. And she was so sad about that one of my other students, Anne Garibaldi, working on her master's, decided to spend her research looking at how to restore Wapato hokokwalots to the Salmon River estuary. And so she put in a number of, she transplanted Wapato back into the estuary in several places and put screens around it so that the cattle couldn't get at it. And we went back some years later, not a few years ago after Mary had passed away, but we went with her daughter Bonnie and her sons, and we went back there, and there it was. I'll have to send you a photo of Anne and Bonnie raising their hands in excitement to find this Wapato growing there so nicely. So that's just one example of a food that was really, really important for a lot of people, was widely traded, was used in the Columbia Valley, but also in the Fraser Valley by people there. And more recently, the researchers from working with the Katzie Nation and Katzie researchers themselves um, discovered it was the salvage kind of archaeobotany project. They found a whole patch of Wapato um, that was turned out to be over 3,500 years old. It was still in place. It was in a wet archaeological site. And they were able to, they had a handful of the tubers, and they look like you could almost eat them. Not
Wow.
quite, but pretty close. And they were embedded with the ends of digging sticks in this archaeological site. So that just shows, how important that particular food was, comparable to camas and other root vegetables. And I've always maintained that people were far more than just hunter gatherers. They didn't just randomly gather up these plants. They were cultivating these plants, the berries, the root vegetables, even the greens, the patches of stinging nettle, whatever. They were being cultivated. They were being translocated from one place to another, looked after. They were using fire and other means to clear the prairies and keep them going and productive. All of these things are, part of what I've been learning over the last 50 years.
That's amazing. Well, I think it's so interesting because I think in modern agriculture we think of, you have to have a field that's tilled and it's all one crop and it's all very, you in a specific quadrant and so many crops per square foot. But historically, what others might consider wild ecosystems or untouched pristine wilderness are actually being managed by local people, like you're saying, with berry patches and the root crops. And um,
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's like a mystery to unravel, to understand how they did it and which crops were important. You've mentioned a few times chemists. Can you tell us a bit more about that particular plant? I don't think it's very commonly known of in the United States.
Hmm. There are two species of edible blue camas in the lily family, or Melianthaceae now maybe. But there's also a death camas, so
Mm,
people have to know the difference. They both have bulbs, and they grow together sometimes. But these two species, the common blue camas and the giant camas, the range extends from Vancouver Island and coastal British Columbia south to into California. Kat Anderson writes about camas down
okay.
there. And east, as far as the Montana, um, the Salish people of the Flathead, formerly Flathead Salish people, also used camas. And in this area, and perhaps the most famous camas users are the Nez Perce, because the Nez Perce wars were fought over the fact that the settlers were taking over and grazing off their camas meadows.
Oh,
And so the Nez Perce leaders were so upset and were trying to combat them, but that was a story in itself. But these bulbs, they take about 6 years or 7 years to grow until they're about the size of a chestnut or so. And they're dug in a very sustainable way. Their habitat is maintained by burning over areas and creating these prairies,
mhm.
and they often are associated with Gary Oak. Um, and so people would dig. Um, we figured out once when Christopher Paul was the one who taught me first about them, and he said the families would have owned these different patches of camas, and they would dig up to a 200-pound potato sack full per
Wow.
family per year. We figured it out once that people on Vancouver Island alone were harvesting about 10 million bulbs a year,
Wow.
just for their staple carbohydrate. And the main carbohydrate in camas is not starch, but inulin, which is a group of complex fructose, based carbohydrates.
Mhm.
And they're not very digestible to eat them raw. They're kind of sticky.
Mhm.
And the best way to convert the inulin into fructose and fructans is the pit cooking, which is long, low level cooking in an underground pit. And that's the way Chris Paul used to cook his. And I learned about pit cooking a lot from another elder, Ida Jones from the Pacheedaht Nation. And we've tried pit cooking camas many times now over the years, and other root vegetables as well. And it's really an important method of cooking that again goes back thousands of years, um,
Right.
maybe in some areas 6, 7, 8,000 years.
Can
Um,
you Can you explain what pit cooking is like? What does the structure look like? How do you do it?
Yeah, well, there are different styles and different plants used in different areas, but essentially, you dig a pit in the ground, and the size depends on how much you want to cook. Um, because this method is used for cooking clams, it's used for cooking fish, it's used for cooking game, deer, whatever.
Mhm.
But for camas, it might be maybe a meter wide and 2/3 of a meter deep. You build a fire in the bottom. You get really dense rocks. I think I have a couple right here, actually.
Great.
These are really heavy volcanic rocks, and these are about the right size. They just fit in your hand. You
Mhm.
get about 100 or more of these rocks. From certain places, you can pick them up. And you put them into the fire when the fire's going until they're glowing red hot. When all the rocks are glowing red hot and the fire's died down a bit, then you start to build up your cooking pit. And you have to do it very quickly. And you take out the unburned wood, you put a post in the middle. This is the method that Ida Jones taught us.
Got you. Okay.
You spread the rocks out on the bottom, and then you put a big armload of salal into the pit onto the rocks. And you get it wet first so it doesn't start to burn right away because of fire. It's really hot in there. And then you put sword fern over the top, a mat of sword fern. And then you put your camas bulbs in a layer. And then you put more sword fern. Then you put bundles of the other root vegetables that you're cooking, like springbank clover and silverweed tied in bundles
Oh,
and interspersed with more sword fern. And then a big armload of salal on the top. Then
what is Salau, by the way?
Oh, salal, Gaultheria shallon. It's in the heather family. It has
Okay.
evergreen, very fragrant evergreen leaves. It's related to wintergreen, if you
Oh,
know
oh,
what
I bet
that
that
is.
sounds amazing. Yeah.
And so it's a common shrub on the west coast here, growing under the conifers. And so then you take that post from the middle, you pull it out, and right away you pour water in through the channel that it creates. And the
Mhm.
water goes down right and hits those hot rocks and creates billows of steam coming out. And then you quickly cover the whole thing with a big mat, used to be cedar mat. Then they used canvas mat, what Ida called cannabis, canvas mat, and you put rocks around the edges and you cover the whole thing with dirt or sand until you can't see any steam escaping. For for camas cooking, they used to leave it overnight. Could be 24 hours.
Wow.
And and then when you uh, when you're ready, you open the pit, you pull back the mat, you're careful not to get sand in the food, you uncover it carefully and you lift the food out. The camas bulbs become quite dark when they're properly cooked, and they're sort of like sweet chestnuts in flavor. And people would dry them like that, eat them immediately if it was, they were having a feast or a family meal. But often those that pit cooking was used to process the food, the root vegetables, and then they were subsequently dried and stored for winter. And so that was a way of, and then camas bulbs were traded too. They were, Erna Gunther said, aside from salmon, they were the most widespread trade product in our area and the southern, well, in the Puget Sound area anyway. People would trade camas and as a really important trade good.
Amazing. Wow. And I love how they're integrating these plants that are so common to British Columbia. I can picture in my mind's eye those beautiful forests with huge ferns and um, it's just in the rocks all coming together. So taking different elements of the environment to 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 produce this amazing food. And what does camas taste like? Is it like a potato? Is it kind of starchy in
Um,
that sense, or?
well, because after cooking, it has a high proportion of fructose,
Hmm.
and so it's quite sweet tasting.
Oh, okay.
It's almost like candy. Some people would say it's like a candy. It's sort of like a sweet chestnut in its flavor.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's
So
great.
yeah, and then in other areas, where salal doesn't grow, Mary Thomas did pit cooking up in the interior, and she used sometimes fir boughs or sometimes even ponderosa pine needles and rose bushes, wild rose, and they also used a kind of grass, calamagrostis, timber grass, it's called,
Mhm.
and put that under their food to protect it. They also cooked it with a black tree lichen, Bryoria fremonti, in the interior, and the black tree lichen actually um, absorbed some of the sugars that were produced and expelled by these cooking roots. So the lichen became like uh, I don't know, a capturing of energy for the root vegetables that were being cooked. One of my other students, Stuart Crawford, did his master's working with Mary Thomas again on the black tree lichen and did a lot of experimental cooking. And that's what he found, what he discovered. It's pretty exciting.
Yeah. Well, in all of your years of studying in this field, Nancy, have what are the things that have most surprised you or delighted you as you kind
Oh,
of gained this knowledge?
well, I guess I've told this story before, but I'll tell it again. It was one of those aha times for me, where I suddenly realized this is far more than what has been uh, recognized. Working with a wonderful teacher, another elder, Kwak clan chief Adam Dick, in the early 1990s, 1994 or so. He was telling me about huquam, which is the northern rice root, Fritillaria camchitensis, and how he, as a boy, he was held, he was hidden away when the police came to take children to residential school. So he never went. And he spent his time being trained as a traditional leader, clan chief, and potlatch speaker. And he went with his mother and grandmothers down to the Tequila root gardens at the estuary of the Kingcome River, where they grew the clover, the taxus, and the tliksam, the silverweed, and the huquam. And he said, yeah, that was my job when I was a boy. I used to take the gagump off the bottom of the huquam and throw it back in the soil, in the dirt. I thought, what? What's that? What's gagump? Gagump in Kwakwala means grandfather.
Oh,
And he said, it's a little thing that grows under the huquam. And it wasn't, I said, well, is that going to grow into a new plant? He said, yeah, that's why we did it. You dummy. He didn't say that, but it was so obvious. And it wasn't until we actually went up to Kingcome and went out with Quaxistala down to the flats with my friend Doug Dewar and our students and his wonderful wife, Kim Rakamakludusi. Um, and he showed me the gago. Then I could see it's not the rice-like grains that grow around the bulb, but a larger sprout that is often formed on the bottom of the larger bulbs of the huquam or rice root. And so, yeah, they replant that. Well, the same year, that summer, I was up in the interior. I was working with Mary Thomas, and she started talking about Schwiesch, the yellow glacier lily, Erythronium grandiflorum. She said, yeah, my mom and my grandma, we'd be up in the hills, and they used to take this part off the bottom of the Schwiesch, the bulb of the glacier lily. We called it the whiskers, she said. And they used to put that back, we plant it back where we were digging. She said we bring the basket of those shui down to the camp and break those whiskers off and make a little pile of them. And the next day we take them back up and plant them. I thought, wow, this is so amazing. Here are two elders, knowledgeable people raised by their grandparents who had this information that nobody, as far as I could tell, had ever actually recorded before about replanting propagules in that systematic way, one down in the tidal marshes of the coast, one up in the subalpine areas of the interior. Two different lilies, two different roots. These people didn't know each other, different languages entirely, doing the same thing. Well, that was an aha time for me. And it opened my eyes. I recognize now people were doing that. I mean, yes, I'd read about it before, replanting the clover rhizomes or, other little things. But when those two stories and accounts came to me, that really hit me on the head. And so then I started looking at all the other ways that people have been cultivating their plants and their habitats at many different scales, from just the individual gagump scale right up to the landscape scale. And all the different things that they did, the governance systems that promoted that, and the education systems, how children are taught those things from an early age, from the time they're toddling around, you
Wow.
know.
It's living sustainability. It's that's amazing. Well, and this kind of ties into my next question, and that is, what advice can you give to students or scholars that are interested in entering into the field of ethnobotany? Um, what are some of the big lessons that you've learned in the techniques that you use, and how to be open to receiving such knowledge that you may not immediately see?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think starting with what I call a mutual love of plants is really important, I think, because without exception, the elders that I've worked with, we've connected at that level right off the bat. So, you know, being familiar with plants in your own world to start with is a wonderful advantage. Also, being what I'd call a perpetual student, always being wanting to learn and recognizing, how important it is to be a student and to recognize that yes, we all know things, but there's so much we don't know. And I will never stop learning all of this. And I think the elders that I've worked with have appreciated that I really genuinely think their knowledge is really important. And that makes them, I think, willing to share it with me. Um, I Let's see, what else can advice can I give? I I can hear Dr. Margaret Saiwalis and Bella Kula saying, "You white people ask too many questions." And I think that's one thing. We're so eager to learn that we sometimes jump into try to push too hard. And I can't tell you the number of times when I've sat with someone and I've asked a question, and the answer that they give makes me think they didn't hear my question at all, because they start off and they start telling a story about something, and to me, I couldn't see the connection. I thought they were just telling me something else. So I listened, and then all of a sudden, bingo, they come right back and answer that question in a beautiful way that I never could have anticipated. So, patience. Another elder I work with, Mayanish, Dr. Daisy Seward Smith, said she was always taught by the elders, you use these and these before you use this. And that's good advice for any of us, I think. Don't try and ask too many questions right away, but be willing to listen and observe and participate and help out in any way you can. Find a way to make yourself useful to people. Take them out berry picking. Often elders who are so knowledgeable, they might they love getting out. They love going berry picking. And often their family might be working and maybe busy and not able to get them out as much as they'd like. So if you can fulfill that role and help get them out where they love to be and be a part of it, it's a wonderful way to learn outdoors, out in the hills or the valleys and on the shoreline, whatever, where they love to be and where it's really fun to be with them.
It's great. It's some of my favorite memories of working with elders and healers in Europe. We've done a lot of my research in the Mediterranean. Some of the most enlightening days have been those where I was just helping with processing herb bundles, going out and helping them collect or tying these up and setting them aside for drying, and just having that loose conversation and just enjoying each other's company and being there to listen and learn from them what
Yeah.
they wanted to share. I think that's definitely an amazing way to learn.
Yeah, it's the best way to learn, and it's so much fun, and then you feel like you're helping, you're being useful too. So that's always nice. Yeah.
Well, as we get close to wrapping up, Nancy, I wondered if you could tell us a bit about, where do you see the future of the field of ethnobotany? You were able to get in on the game early on when it was really still an emerging field in terms of like the modern scientific version of ethnobotany. Um, and where do you think we're going? And what roles do you think that this field can play to better the world, better humanity? And what can ethnobotanists do?
I think ethnobotanists can be a support system, I guess you could say, for Indigenous peoples and knowledge holders all over the world, whose knowledge has often been suppressed, has often been under recognized, has often been taken without permission. Um, and so I see ourselves as being supporters of knowledge holders, of Indigenous people, of local people, um, and allies of these people, um, because we have been privileged to have, as trained ethnobotanists, we've been privileged to have education in the post-secondary institutions, and we might uh, we might have access to different services and different people than that local people don't have. We can be servants to
Hmm.
these people, and we can help them and support them to regain what they've lost, and to give them back the power over their own lives, their own lands, their own knowledge, and uh, and that's the way. That's the most just way that anything can be. There's been a lot of movement since I started. When I started, there was nothing in the way of like ethics, research ethics. There were no conversations like that. I was more or less just trying to make my own way and do the best that I could to be ethical in my approach. But there were no guidelines or anything like that. And so that's something that's changed for the better, I think, that yes, it's onerous to go through an research ethics application process, but it's also really, really important to recognize that you need to get permission from people to document things, and you need to make sure that they're okay with it, and you need that they need to know what you plan to do with the information, and that's all part of that. And with the declaration, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and even before that with the UN uh, UNDRIP and UNSED um, Conference on Environment and Development, and what came out of that, the Convention on Biodiversity. Um, and before that, the Declaration of Belém that came from ethnobotanists like Daryl Posey. There's been a continuous support uh, for recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples and local peoples. And I think as ethnobotanists, we've been played a role in that, raising awareness, and we can continue to play that role and continue to find a way to help in conservation and restoration, but all done in collaboration with, in alliance with the knowledge holders that we work with.
Absolutely. I think that's the key is collaboration and ethical engagement are so important. And I mean, I think it is to our advantage that now we do have better guidance, that's out there, that these codes of ethics have been developed. So there's a roadmap now that young scholars can follow. I think that's really great. Well, Nancy, this has been so much fun speaking with you. Do you have any last things you'd like to add or share? Or is there a place where people can find your books? I know you've written extensively on these themes.
Thanks, Cassie. I've really enjoyed it too. Um, my books have been variously published in different places. To the Ancient Pathways and the most recent book, Plants, People, and Places, um, are published through McGill Queen's University Press. And so you can go to their website and find out how to get them. Other books, I have a book coming out that I edited called Loose Cheem's Plants. It's with Harbor Publishing, and it should be out in the next few months. And Loose Cheem is an elder I've worked with for many years, Dr. Loose Cheem Arvid Charlie of the Cowichan Nation, Holcomitanum. And he was raised by his grandparents and great grandfather, and very, very knowledgeable man, who really gifted me with being able to work with him and record his knowledge in this book. And so that should be out soon. And Harbor Publishing has also taken over the Plants of Haida book. The third edition should be out any day now from them. And other books are out of print, but I think The Earth's Blanket is still in print through Douglas and McIntyre, which is really Harbor Publishing again. Yeah, so probably on the web you can track down things.
Yeah. I'll be sure to add links also on the podcast website for this. This is great, and you write so beautifully, and you've done such amazing work, and it's just been a privilege to speak with you today. Thanks so much, Dan.
Oh, thanks so much. I enjoyed it too. Take good care, Cassie.
Thank you.
Okay.
You've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious, recorded remotely on Zoom during the COVID-19 isolation period. You can find this and all of our other episodes at our website at foodiepharmacology.com. You can also find us on all major podcast streaming services. If you'd like to see the video to this episode, be sure to head to our Teach Ethnobotany YouTube channel and click on the Foodie Pharmacology playlist. Thanks so much for listening. Stay healthy out there, and I'll see you next time.